This is the second part of Just War and the responsibility to protect. We have just seen Just War as a so-called, you could say, a response to the previous week where we addressed the perspective of war being the preferred way to solve, preferred way of solving problems. When you feel you're in a position of strength, you just go for it. And Clausewitz and earlier Sun Tzu have explained all the ways in which this can be done successfully. And we have seen, of course, that it has a lot of negatives. And in the first part of this week's presentation, we looked at the special case of war that is not waged in order to solve the problem by just eliminating the enemy, but rather war as a last resort way of preventing an enemy, not only to myself, but you could call it an enemy of humankind, to prevent that enemy from causing undeserved damage to oneself or to others. So legitimate intervention through war. The problem that remains is it's still through war. In other words, you do the peaceful thing, but by violent means, and we've seen it's always somewhat problematic. But in some extreme cases, it may nevertheless be temporarily the best, or actually the only solution. When it's the only solution, it's the best, and the worst, it's the only solution. But we have also seen that there's a general sense that ultimately one would hope that humankind can reach a point where it does no longer need war, even just war, to settle its differences, and where the international community, through the United Nations or whatever may replace it, is able to intervene and to stop the fighting before it happens. Now, in this presentation, the emphasis will be on the responsibility to protect, which I've already presented as being a really special case where a specific type of just war, even though the UN never uses that term, is accepted and even recommended, which is kind of unusual, rather unusual and unexpected. But when you hear of the circumstances, it becomes somewhat logical. So I've already explained about the dove and its ambiguity. For those of you who are not Americans, in the US, people like to make it short. And so responsibility to protect becomes R2P. And that's even used in a very official documents. R, responsibility, P, protect, and two sounds like two, TO. So this notion holds powerful nations responsible for not intervening militarily, even militarily, against state actors that are violently persecuting minorities or other exposed groups within their nation. So a government that doesn't do its job well, other powerful governments see that and they just don't do anything. The paradox is that such intervention almost inevitably implies violent action. And that's what I just discussed. It's for the good cause, but it's violent, so there's going to be casualties. Examples, Rwanda, but that's an example where precisely nothing happened. And there was violence, not because of the intervention, because of the non-intervention. That was before R2P became an official principle of the United Nations. And actually, that's the event that caused the UN to consider that very more seriously than before. Then there's Kosovo, where there was an intervention, but it was by the United Nations, by the United States, one country, not authorized by the United Nations. And then, of course, to defend the Kosovo Albanians, the majority of the population, which was definitely being not just persecuted, but subjected to ethnic cleansing, as they say. It's a very nice, like, complex expression, which means you eliminate one people by throwing them out of the country or killing them. But that, of course, implied that to stop the Serbs from doing that, they attacked Serbia itself, official buildings and military, and they caused casualties. So, facing all that, no intervention, which leaves people in certain states exposed in a way that goes against the conscience of those who just look at it and feel we should intervene, or intervention by this or that country, but completely at their discretion in a way that maybe the international community wouldn't approve. So all this, and I make it short because, of course, you can, as I always say, look it up. It's not difficult to find all the details needed. There was a discussion. There were lots of there was lots of back and forth, but it led to the 2005 World Summit outcome document that has 3 paragraphs. Essentially, the third paragraph is just very short and doesn't have much content. Here you have 138, which says that actually the responsibility to protect is responsibility of the governments of the nation itself. So if something is happening in Rwanda, like a civil war or some violence, public, civil disorder, it's the Rwanda Republic government's responsibility to do something about it. That's the first thing. Second, if Rwanda has, to take an example, has difficulties, is trying, but the unrest is too much, the government cannot handle it, then the international community should, as appropriate, encourage and help that particular state. In other words, help. And then there will be the third one that we'll see a little bit later. So again, this became an official binding documents by the United Nations that allowed potentially for for countries on behalf of the United Nations to intervene even militarily. It has 3 stages, as we've often seen. There are many times 3 stages to thanks, basically before, during, and after. Here, it's the stages by responsibility, by who has responsibility. So the first one, as I have just explained, the state itself is responsible to handle the problems within its borders. Second pillar, if they can't or don't do that, then the international community is responsible to encourage and assist individual states in meeting that responsibility. Now you can already see how can you do that, and who is the international community? I guess the United Nations. And then the third pillar is if a state manifestly is failing to protect its populations, which happens a lot actually, the international community must be prepared to take appropriate collective action in a timely and decisive manner and in accordance with the UN Charter. That's as far as R2P goes, to specifically authorize military force to be used. Decisive, timely, and decisive manner. It doesn't say militarily, but that's what it means. Intervene in a decisive manner. And then, but according to the charter and, all the caution that is, so you can feel very reluctantly is this accepted? Very reluctantly, but nevertheless, we cannot just say, not our problem. So that shows actually, at least in the face of it on paper, it looks, I would say, pretty good. It means that basically countries are responsible. It's if a country has problems, it's the government's responsibility. It's not other people who should intervene. Like if you have a problem at home, it's your home, not somebody else's. Secondly, of course, we should help if help is needed and asked for. And if the government doesn't even ask for help, then you have to suggest, knock, knock, hey, you're having a real problem here. We want to help. What can we do? And third, if they slam the door on you, then, well, you may have to break in and with force that government to do right by its own people. So it sounds like a very measured but responsible way to react by the United Nations. That's why responsibility to protect. Now here is paragraph 139. 138 was the first one that I showed where it says government should do it itself and the community should help. This is the one about intervention. And I just read the bold letters. The United Nations also has the responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means. In other words, even when the UN intervenes, it doesn't mean just to go in with your guns, military action. It means diplomacy, humanitarian aid, that the government cannot or doesn't want to provide it, then the UN comes in, and other peaceful means in accordance with blah, blah, blah of the Charter. And only when that is not enough, when you have situations like genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, other crimes against humanity, in this context, we are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner, which I've just read, through the Security Council. That means the Security Council, which is the only part of the United Nations which has the power of decision. The General Assembly can make statements, it can make resolutions, but they are not binding. In other words, it's just basically advice, strong advice, but the Security Council can make binding decisions. Binding means they cannot be ignored and they have consequences on a case-by-case basis. Should peaceful means be inadequate and national authorities manifestly fail to protect their population? So these are the criteria that are given. When can we intervene even if the country doesn't want intervention? Under those circumstances, major crimes against humanity, systematic crimes, and the government manifestly doesn't want to do anything. I let you read the rest, pause and read. It's all interesting, but not essential. Now, again, another trinity, if you will, 3 stages. And here you have a map of places where it took intervention of R2P intervention happened or did not happen what should have happened. First, responsibility to prevent. So, of course, as much as possible, the UN should intervene before there is a disaster. Second, and that's the one that we usually think about, the responsibility to act, to intervene, to stop ongoing atrocities. That's what happened whenever it happened. And third, the responsibility to rebuild. Again, that is usually forgotten, but actually it's very important because once everything is destroyed, which is usually the case when you have a civil war, and not to mention an intervention by the United Nations, there's lots of destruction. And if then the UN just says, okay, we did our job, goodbye, and the country is left in a situation of absolute misery, then the population may suffer even more than it did during the war. So that's the 3 elements. Now, there are immediate problems with that beautiful general principle of the responsibility to protect and the way it was exposed in that UN resolution. And of course, there are many objections to responsibility to protect, even though it was voted by the United Nations, but not everybody agreed. Some people said never intervened. The main objection is that of selectivity. You know what selective prosecution is? If crimes are committed, you prosecute them. That's fine. If somebody commits a crime, you prosecute. But if you only prosecute certain people and you don't prosecute the other people who did exactly the same thing, that's called selective prosecution. That's a problem. And many tyrannical governments do that. You know, they let you do all kinds of things, no problem, like corruption. But here and there, you pick somebody and you prosecute them. It's the law, because if you apply the law, yeah, it's the law says you can't do that. But you just don't do it for most people. That in itself is not acceptable on a legal level. Here, it's not a selective prosecution, but it's more selective protection. Why did the UN intervene in this case, but not in that case? And that leads very quickly to accusations of having that intervention done for out of self-interest. You intervened here because it was in your interest. You say it's to help, but it's also in your interest. In that case, they need help just as much, but you did not intervene. Why? Well, because you have no interest. It doesn't help you at all, so you don't care. So that's the most common objection to the principle or to the way R2P has been enforced. And it quickly leads to being not just an objection, but an accusation. And so here is a quote: why act in Kosovo but not in Rwanda? Now that's pre R2P. Remember, the decision by the UN or the resolution was made in 2005. So anything that happened before that is R2P, maybe in the general sense, the idea that we are responsible to protect, just like each one of us is responsible morally to protect the innocent. You know, and when South Korea was invaded by North Korea, the UN saw it as its responsibility to protect South Korea. But these were not done in uh, as a matter of as an application of the responsibility to protect resolution. It was before that, and it was done in many ways, and it's done in many ways. Each time one of us sees a child being abused or attacked, we normally go to protect, right? Or we protect the environment. There's many ways of protecting, and we could be, or we can be held responsible for doing it or not doing it. But 2005, that's the moment when it became official on the political level. So Kosovo, the Americans intervened, but the UN didn't intervene in Rwanda. We know why, because there was no mandate. Why protect the Kurds in northern Iraq but not in Turkey? I'm not going to go in detail in each one about each one. Why emphasize a crisis in Somalia, where America was active, and not a 3-decade-long emergency in neighboring Sudan? And it's still going on today. And that's not a recent quote. Why intervene? And that one is interesting. Why intervene against smaller states but ignore Russian actions in Chechnya? That was then. Since then, Chechnya was, how should I say, it was handled by the Russian government, and now it works with Russia. It's part of Russia, but it was a province that was rebelling against the central government. So nobody intervened, and Russia took it under its control, like China did with Tibet. It relates in large part, and of course, I'm not saying that there is no legitimate reason to accuse nations for not intervening in some cases because they don't have any interest, because it's possible. There are all kinds of bad reasons for doing things and not doing things, but there are also good reasons. And one of the good reasons is what is called the precautionary principles. That is part of the United Nations statement. When it comes to direct military intervention, however, R2P requires the applications of what international humanitarian law terms precautionary principles. And basically what it means, I'll let you read the rest, is when a military action has a good chance to increase harm, that means to making things worse than by not intervening, then even though it may be justified, don't do it. You know, you need all the good reason to intervene. You need the Security Council to say, okay, do it. And the Security Council, by the way, will never say we intervene. It's not the Security Council. They allow a country on behalf of the United Nations to intervene, usually a powerful country. And you can see all the problems with that. Usually the country volunteers and is then allowed, which means why do they volunteer? Maybe, in any case, it's complex. But even if all that is fine, but if the conclusion is, well, it will be good, but it's never going to work, then don't do it. It would be morally good to try, but it would actually not be morally good because you know that you will fail. It will cause a lot of additional casualties that are not necessary, and you will solve nothing. So that is a main reason why in certain cases there was an intervention and other cases there was no intervention. Again, there can be also very bad excuses. That's true, because nations are selfish like people, but there are also very good reasons. A second point about the precautionary principle is that when you cannot intervene militarily, or even before trying, you can use economic sanctions and also prosecution of war criminals. And I'll remind you that a perfect case where military intervention is a no-no is the current situation in Ukraine. The UN voted against the Russian intervention or Russian attack, invasion of Ukraine. It did. Not everybody voted for it, but it did on the level of the General Assembly, which has no real power. But the Security Council first voted against it because Russia is in the Security Council, so they are not going to support an action against themselves. And number two, even if by some kind of a miracle it was able to pass, let's say the Russian representative was sick on that day and nobody else came, there's no chance of success because Russia is too powerful. So intervening is not helpful. And so even unilaterally, NATO is not intervening. They're watching out what's going to happen. They are not directly intervening. Actually, they are doing as much as conceivable without intervening by giving weapons to Ukraine and all that. So that shows you when you have a very powerful country involved, usually there is no intervention because it has veto power and secondly, it's too strong. So with Chechnya, nobody did anything. Why? Chechnya is a province of Russia. And Russia is much too strong. You cannot just go into Russia, send a few UN troops into Russia and say, okay, you cannot persecute your own population. So it didn't happen. And actually, according to the precautionary principles, it was the right thing to do. It would have led to a catastrophe. But economic sanctions, yeah. And with Ukraine today, well, they have been working not so well, but helping a little bit maybe. In any case, there is a lot of economic sanctions against Russia and prosecution. The president of Russia and a number of other Russian leaders have been indicted by the International Criminal Court with little success, obviously, but so that's where we're at. Now, here is a brief overview of the application of R2P. How was it applied in real life? And of course, as you can see, it's not very long. And in time, it started in 2007. So the first real intervention, the use of that principle by the UN took place 2 years after it was officially made into a resolution by the UN. And the last one was in 2011. So that gives us what? It gives us 4 years. Over 4 years immediately after the declaration. After that, it became clear not going to work and it became moot. So basically now you can say it's dead because it can be resurrected maybe one day, but it's difficult to see at this stage how that could happen. So the first intervention was in Kenya, and I'm not going to into the details. Would take much too long, but it was a mediation. There was an issue of civil unrest and lots of violence because of an election. You know, the loser didn't want to leave and so on. So the United States, United Nations Secretary General at that time, Kofi Annan, who happened to be from Kenya, by the way, intervened and mediated. So that was a typical case where the UN intervened, but not militarily, and it worked for a while. Second was Ivory Coast. The United Nations operations in Ivory Coast, UNOCI, CI Côte d'Ivoire in French, led to the prosecution of the former president who had committed atrocities against its own population. So again, an intervention that had a very small military component, but essentially what it did, it removed the president and sent him to the International Criminal Court. So again, it was not war. The one that was really an example of R2P, the way we imagine something terrible happening, and then the Security Council tells a nation or a group of nations, okay, you have a okay to intervene, even militarily, and then they do it. That was in Libya, 2011, against the former regime of President Gaddafi. The United Nations Security Council authorized all necessary measures. And the ones who received that authorization was NATO. And for once the European initiated it, the French were the first to bomb Benghazi, that was being, or the central forces that were bombing Benghazi. And then the United Nations had a bigger gun, so they were asked to please come and help, and their submarines started bombing as well. But what did it do? It did not just protect the population in Benghazi and elsewhere that was being brutalized and killed, massacred by Gaddafi's regime. It led to regime change, which was not appreciated, in particular by Russia and China, who said, well, if that's what you understand by R2P, we will not allow it anymore. Because Gaddafi was essentially a pro-Soviet or China. It was largely a Marxist government, Islamic Marxism, and it was unexpected that China and Russia would go along with it, and they were not particularly excited, but they did, because Gaddafi had complied with many of the things the United States had asked him to do, and he had given up on his nuclear potential. You know, he was trying to get nuclear bombs, so he had become some kind of a good guy. But then when he started destroying his own population, then there was this intervention. So that two things. First, it led to regime change, which meant that's more than R2P should be. So R2P now, no thank you. And number two, it led to a total mess, because what regime change means, you had a stable but evil regime that was destroyed and led to an endless struggle between the many tribes that make up Libya, and that to this day has not been resolved. So it's questionable where it was even a good thing. And number three, it is one of the things that a country like North Korea today is considering when, or was considering, now they're no longer considering, when they were about to, possibly give up on their nuclear weapons in order to have uh, an end to the sanctions and to be recognized and accepted by the world community, including the United States. They realize that if we do that, if we do anything that UN or the US doesn't like, they will eliminate us and they will have us killed. Uh, so no, we keep our nukes. So it had all these negative effects in spite of the good intention of sorts. So the same year, you have the situation in Syria where the regime of the Assad regime do similar things to its population, to the part of its population that was rebelling, as the Gaddafi regime did in Libya. This time it was not Benghazi, but Aleppo and other places. And Russia was behind them, this time much closer to Russia than Libya. And for that reason and the bad experience in Libya, Russia said no, and China same. So what happened is nothing, except some very limited humanitarian aid, where you can think, what does it help? And that was a good case of course it helps, but helping people who are dead doesn't help that much. And even if they are not dead, the moment they get their food, maybe, the next day they will be dead. So, and it was never really very successful. So it became an endless tragedy. And ever since, there was what we see here, the limit and of the whole principle due to the legitimate authority of the Security Council. That's the legitimate authority, and its automatic paralysis due to the fact that 5 countries have veto power. So you will never have something happening anywhere in the world where an intervention is in the interest of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. Wherever it is, there will be one of them will say no. And so at this time, it will never, the collective intervention will never be blessed by the United Nations because of that. And another principle that is strongly emphasized by the UN is multilateralism. Every country has the same value, the same voice, and together we have to do that. But the fact that there's a Security Council with 5 permanent members who have a veto power basically flies into the face of that multilateralism. It means that, yeah, everybody has a voice, but some voices count and some don't. So these are the limits of, and pretty much so far, the end of R2P, which is very sad in a way, because situations like Rwanda could have been helped if the UN troops that were there had the authorization to use their weapons, even just to threaten the ones who, came with their machetes against the minority. Even just the threat of intervention would have been enough. And if not, they could have used their, automatic weapons, machine guns against machete-armed killers. It would have worked very well. But as I explained, so basically it shows as long as we live in this kind of a world that's dominated by violence, it's very difficult to find a supreme authority that really works for the good of everybody and that is empowered to do that. Now, that's a summary of what I said. R2P interventions can backfire and lead to worse consequences than if they had not intervened. That's Libya. And we will see in 2 weeks that Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace in that document, Kant strongly opposes R2P. It was not called that way. It says no state shall by force interfere with the constitution or government of another state. And I would say the Libya example shows that he has a point. And in the current state, it will not happen anyway. Now, a few very special cases. Here you have that's more like out of interest, but nevertheless. This is a Chinese poster that happened a few years back when Nancy Pelosi, under Barack Obama, was the Speaker of the House, if you remember her. And she visited Taiwan. And that made the communist government in China very unhappy. You know, each time a US representative visits Taiwan, they're very unhappy because that means recognizing Taiwan as an independent state, even without saying so. So the government produced this interesting poster, which looks probably a little bit mysterious to you. It says, "No one likes war, but no father would ever allow someone to steal its child." So the child, that's Taiwan. That lady who looks like Mother Mary with but actually the European nation stars on top of the head that make her look like a saint. That's Nancy Pelosi, who is coming to take Taiwan, to liberate Taiwan. But for China, it's not liberate, take Taiwan away. And this very strong, typical socialist realism type father said, basically, we don't want war, but if you come to take Taiwan, we are going to fight. That's basically. So responsibility to protect against us, don't even think about it, which would be try to protect Taiwan. Don't even think about it. The situation in Ukraine, I already mentioned it briefly, and here is something that the Wall Street Journal wrote. It's an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, just about 1 month after the beginning of the war, when right away the Russian army started. They thought in 3 days they would take over Kiev and change the government, and very quickly they felt, it was a disaster for them. Then they caught up again, and what happened since. This particular op-ed suggests that, as Clausewitz noted, and Sun Tzu too, when an army is in retreat, it is possible to inflict the greatest damage on his forces, disorganized and disheartened. Remember, leaving one opening for the enemy to escape? So instead of fighting you with maximum power and cause lots of damage, let him escape, and then you can destroy him because it's easy. So that gentleman suggests the US must do everything possible to exploit this unprecedented opportunity for a decisive victory against a dangerous opponent. So that was an advice to the United States, Biden government, to intervene and to finish off the Russians in Ukraine, which again shows that's the kind of thing that can happen in R2P. You intervene, even if the UN had accepted, but it wouldn't. You intervene, but what you really do is not just to protect the country that's being attacked, but you use it as a good reason or an excuse to eliminate the attacker and cause regime change in his country, which when you see it here looks like not a very good idea, but it exists. So these things all contributed to the fact that R2P is essentially dead today. And that concludes my presentation.